everyone, and welcome back to my channel. This week I'm going to be showing you guys how I make my pet portraits. So I have been doing quite a lot of these recently. They make for great gifts, also really good memorial pieces, which is going to be what I'm doing today. I have a really close friend of mine who is also my videographer for all of my videos and editor. You can find him at Third Eye Cinema on Instagram. But essentially his cat passed a couple months ago from cancer and I wanted to make a piece to memorialize him. So this week that is what I'm going to be going over, and this will work for just about any sort of animal. So if it's not like, you know, a dog or a cat, you want to make like a cow. I love cows. But if you wanted to paint anything else with this technique, it will totally work as long as you have a good picture of it. So let's go ahead and dive into it. All right. Welcome to my little painting corner in my house. So this is going to be the pet portrait that we do. So I have mine all printed out. You're gonna wanna print yours out. You're also going to want a white canvas and some tracing paper and a pencil. This tracing paper I just got from Michael's. I think it was like $10 or something. And they give you a lot. Like, I think I bought this, oh God, like at least like 7 years ago, and I'm still going through it because you can really just kind of reuse this stuff. So I have this, and I have cut a piece out to the same size that I have my picture. And I have a little bit of tape. So the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna have our canvas all prepped. I like to gesso mine so that way it kind of gets rid of the texture of the canvas itself. We're gonna take a little piece of tape. Just tape this right where you want it. This is Queso, by the way. He's my friend's cat, and he just passed away of cancer, so he's gonna be getting this piece afterwards, and I'm very excited to do this for him because look at the baby. You can kind of see that the legs kind of got cut off here a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and draw those in later, but if you end up not feeling confident being able to kind of just sketch something in afterwards, probably reprint this to a size where you can fit the entire thing on it. And it doesn't have to be in color. Mine just came out in color also because I am really running low on black ink. So we're just gonna go ahead and tape this up, and I'm gonna make sure it's just kind of where I want him to sit onto the canvas here. And I'm going to stick the darker sheet face down towards the canvas underneath here. And all we are gonna do is just kind of nestle that in, and we're just gonna trace. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead with my pencil. It doesn't have to be a pencil, it can be a pen, but I'm just gonna go in and trace all of the general outline in the prominent features. And graphite paper goes mainly by pressure, so even if your pencil is dull or if it's a pen, you really don't need it to be perfect. You just want to get a rough sketch in here. So, and notice how I'm not going outside of these lines really. I'm kind of giving it a little bit of an interior border here. That's just in case, you know, when we are trying to blend it with the background, everything like that, we have room to kind of spread out rather than things getting, you know, too big and then trying to kind of bring it in. It's a lot easier to kind of expand your painting outwards than it is to bring it inward. So this part gets a little bit blurry, but I can kind of see the little chin marks of him. You definitely want to get the mouth and the nose. I always find that the nose and the eyes, like the placement of it, is kind of the most important part, at least as far as making it look like having its likeness. I also feel like with the eyes, I try a little bit harder. Okay, so we have just kind of the general thing outlined. If I lift this up, you'll be able to see it. The nice part about having this taped here is when you put it back down, it's gonna be right back where it is, which is pretty helpful. Now what I like to do is kind of almost create myself like a paint by number situation. So I'll go ahead and usually find the dark spots, especially in the patterns up here, and I'll just kind of just give myself a little outline of where it is, like the darker spots. And this doesn't have to be pretty. We all know that this is just gonna look like scribbles at first, but you trust the process, right? I'll do the lines of where these are, because I know this is where the dots of the whiskers are gonna be. And then I'll kind of just give myself relative things to follow by. And I like using something that's going to mark on here. Like if you are just using pressure, that's fine. But I like that my pencil is going to give me kind of somewhere to like look at when I use this as a reference later. So that way when I'm painting, if I get lost on where my pencil is, I can kind of go back and look at these marks and then look underneath and be like, oh, that's where that color belongs. And I usually go for the dark spot. You can do the lights, or if you want like your mid-tone to be the thing that you outline, that's fine. For me, I just feel like, especially with cats, they usually have such a distinct pattern in their fur that it makes it a little bit easier to kind of get it to look like the actual cat when you can see the facial marks. He's got a little striped tail here. Perfect. Okay. So we can go ahead and look. Great. Now, I also have this photo up too. Having, you know, just kind of a photo reference with you will definitely help this a bit. And so I'm going to kind of zoom in on his feet. I'm going to get rid of like this little chair here that he's, you know, kind of getting blocked by. And I'm just going to kind of draw this through and just... And I can see that right here where these two paws meet up. It's something that was kind of hard to see in the printout. So I'm just going to kind of put those in, and I see that the bottom half of this paw kind of gets cut off by the other. So we'll leave that there, and then I'm going to bring the tail out a little bit. I am using an 11 by 14 painting, or an 11 by 14 canvas, which is gonna make this just a little bit larger than how I could have printed to. So once we have that, we'll go ahead and get started on the painting part of it. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and start on the background first. I like to do this because, especially with furry animals, the fur is gonna kind of overlap a little bit, and you don't wanna be painting around all those like little like pieces of fuzz happening later on. So I find this to be easier to do in the beginning than it is at the end. But you can do whatever you want because it's your art. So I'm gonna keep the blue and the kind of the blue-orange tones because they really complement each other, hence why they're complementary. And they really help the subject stand out. So I have kind of pre-mixed some paints here. I got a Payne's gray that I've kind of mixed with, you know, a little bit of purple, and we're going to kind of go in and blend all of these. One thing I do like to add is if you don't want your animal or whatever your subject is really in any painting, my hack to making everything look a bit more cohesive is finding one underlaying color and use that in every color that you mix. My favorite thing to use is kind of like this like beige here, like this like tan color. Essentially, it's going to be something that I mix into my background and into all of the oranges to really get those colors of the cat. So I mixed these in, and I did mix a little bit of this in there, and it's just gonna kind of help the colors settle a little bit more, and it makes things less like 2D, I guess is the word. Because if you just put colors on top of each other, like it doesn't look like they flow, you know, they're not from the same palette, it doesn't really look natural or realistic. So for me, that's my favorite thing to do. You can, and white does not work with this. You need to pick some sort of base tone. So that can be like a yellow ochre is great. I've seen people do this with pink before. They just paint the entire canvas pink and then paint on top of it. We're not gonna do that. But if you want to kind of have this flow a little bit more, I would suggest finding some sort of base color to mix into all of your paints. So that way it kind of looks just a little bit nicer. So I always start with the darkest colors on my edges. And with acrylic, you really want to think about the fact that once it's dry, it doesn't really blend anymore. That is kind of the downfall to acrylic versus oil, whereas oil, it's a bit easier to make things look realistic because you have a lot of time to blend those. But for me, I'm just gonna do a little bit. Of each color. And I like to add a little bit of water to my paint to kind of get to flow. And I'm just kind of going through with all of my shades, and we're just going for it. Okay, so if you did what I just did, where you just saw I went over the entire part that I had blocked out originally, I'm just gonna go ahead and take a flat brush like this and just kind of scoop some of that out while I can still kind of see my line. You don't have to, but just enough that, you know, I can still kind of roughly see it. And we're just gonna leave that there. That's fine, we can paint over it. That's the nice thing that I like about acrylic, is you can just kind of keep giving it layers until it looks the way you want it to look. Okay, so I have a lot of this still pretty wet, but I want to go ahead and add in a little bit of black. So I'm going to water down my brush just enough to get a little bit of black in there. And I'm going to kind of go in and get these areas like in the tail. And if it feels like everything that would mix with is already dry, we'll just go ahead and add a little more color on top of that. Okay, so I've gone ahead and pre-mixed all of my paint just so that way we can go ahead and kind of get through this video. So I have started out with just a bunch of different like orangey tones to try and just match all the different shades. I like to start out with like 3 to 5 of these, and we'll just kind of use these intermittently throughout, you know, all of these like little lines that I've put in there. And for the colors that I ended up using to kind of make this like orangey tone here, because you want it to not be too, you know, like bright orange, because then it's gonna look more like a cartoon. So I started out like I did with my background with this like beige. So remember how we kind of used our base color throughout the entire thing so that way we could make it all look cohesive. And then I did also include just a touch of the Payne's Gray in here, just to also kind of bring in this background color into our cat photo. I also used a little bit of orange, some white, some black, some burnt sienna, and some yellow ochre. And these were all the bases that I used. And the black and white was just to kind of get it to desaturate a little bit. So, you know, if you take orange and then you add white and then you add black and then you add white and you add black, like it's never gonna go back to being as bright as that color once was, just because the lights and the darks end up just kind of taking out that color and dulling it, which is why like even if you know, try to get back to this after you've mixed the color, it'll never fully go back to that once it's been mixed with anything. So we'll go ahead and get started. I tend to like to use the dark shade first, just so that way I can end up building off of that, because usually the dark shade kind of indicates like a shadow. So I'm gonna go, these guys are kind of almost about the same color. This one is a little bit more brown and this one's a little bit more orange. I'm gonna use the one that's like a little bit more dulled out brown for the background browns, like kind of behind the cat over here, because the further away something is and the more like out of a like focus it is, the more muted it's gonna look. So hence the brown instead of orange. So I'm just gonna kind of follow this line here. We'll just start. And this can go in whatever way you want. You don't have to follow my lines exactly with your cat or like whatever animal you're doing, just whatever seems to fit. And you can go over acrylic as many times as you want. So I like doing this because I know I'm just gonna repaint and repaint like 26 different times. I'll go up here. And it kind of fades a little bit more out here. So, you know, since I don't have any lines that I'm worried about covering up, I'm just gonna do a base coat of this color. Okay, now I'm also gonna do the same thing with the tail over here, because that's also more of a background piece. But I'm just gonna do it on the dark spots here. So where I kind of put those stripes in to indicate where the tail line was. Now you're gonna see me jump around kind of a lot in this video, mainly because the way that I do this, especially because we're doing acrylic paint, is I kind of work in sections because of the fact that acrylic dries and it's not blendable after a while. So the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna take a little bit of white and add this in on the side of my palette here. So I'm just gonna take a little bit of this and I'm just gonna add it to the corner of the color that I just did, making just a little bit of a lighter shade of what I just, perfect. And just because I did it like in the same little section here, it kind of makes it easier to see like what that contrast is gonna look like on your painting. So I can see that there are a few lines right in here of that just barely lighter color. I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of, you know, do that in here. And, you know, if things look a little blocky, what I like to do is I'll end up cleaning my brush off, getting it not like super dry, but just drier, and just kind of using that to blend out just a little bit. Just kind of helps soften the edges there. All right. And the cat tail, I can see over here, is quite a bit lighter than this light shade that I did over here. So after I'm done with this, I'm gonna go ahead and add some more white into that section. So I'm gonna take more white, add that right into the corner. And I kind of like to do this where it's like I have my lightest, my medium, and my dark. So that way, you know, if I ever need to like touch up a spot that I missed after it's dried, I still have that color. So I can see that the lighter is gonna be in between here. Now I use my lightest of that color and my darkest of that color in the tail. And I am gonna end up kind of blending it out with that mid-tone in just a minute. So I'm gonna take my mid-tone now. You can clean off your brush or not. I tend to not clean off my brush. And I'm just, from the part that's furthest away, which would be behind the cat over here, what I'm gonna do is kind of use a little bit more of that mid-tone in the back than I would in the front. Just because the front's gonna be the lightest. Now it's kind of hard to see from this photo over here, but I do also have my iPad up next to me because that's helpful. I can see that that tail is really just kind of in front of that leg there. So, whereas here it just kind of ends. So I'm just gonna kind of just take this light color and loop that over. But we also kind of want to make sure that we've got a shadow going on there. So what I'm gonna do is do the opposite over the other side. So I'm gonna add a little bit of black over in the other corner. And a little bit of black goes a long way. So you can kind of see that there. And I'm just gonna kind of trail a little shade underneath here. Now the next thing I like to do is see if this color matches anything else that I might need, which the lightest color I think kind of matches the inside of the legs here. So I'm gonna go ahead and use that before that kind of dries up, because you also kind of want to be thinking timing wise, you know, how much time do I have to be able to create this color or use this color that I have. So I'm kind of seeing this line here and these couple here. Now I'm gonna go back to my mid-tone. Maybe we'll blend some of that out. So then I'm gonna go back to my original color that I had mixed in this. And I can see that the outside of this is a little bit darker, but I remember that I used that dark color for right over here. So what I'm gonna wanna do is, actually instead of going here, I'm gonna take that little bit of black that I mixed into that same color, and I'm just gonna kind of line this side here. Just to make sure that when I lay it down that it doesn't look like it's just blending in and it's like part of the same thing. You know, you don't want your legs looking like they're attached to its butt. And I'm actually gonna take that darker side too and just go right here in the middle just to kind of outline that a bit. And we can add maybe a little more black in there just so that way that stands out, because behind the legs is probably gonna be the darkest part of it. Cool. So now we'll go back to this one tone that we've been kind of blending off of, and I'm just gonna line the sides here. Like I said, I'm sorry if this is like all over the place, guys. This is just the way that my brain works. All right, now I'm gonna kind of move on to my different colors here. So this was the other kind of darker ones of the original 4 that I had mixed up. I'm just adding a little bit of like water into it because, you know, you wanna, if you're working with acrylics and you're really trying to like keep things blending, adding a little bit of water to make sure the consistency stays the way that you want it to is really helpful. Okay. So now I'm gonna kind of go in and find all of these like little lines that I've drawn, and we'll just kind of go in and do tiny little fur stripes, I guess. This is gonna be our dark tone. And I can kind of see these like lines right here underneath where the chin is. Cool. All right, so I have kind of all of those lined up, and then I'm gonna go into kind of my lighter of the 4 that I'd started with, which is gonna be this one right over here. We'll add some water, make sure it's still smooth. All right, and we're just gonna kind of fill in everything we didn't already do. So. And I always make sure to clean my brush if it starts to blend too much, because you do still want to get those patterns in there, because that's what gives any sort of, especially like feline, like its identifiable pattern, and really helps with the likeness of it. The only part of this that I'm not going to fill in are going to be the eyes and right around this mouth, because that's going to be our lightest area. And that's like almost like a white. Another reason that I add the darks first is you can see where this gets a little thin. You can still see the dark underneath it. So even if I cover it up, we can go back in and still see all of our details and kind of like add more depth to those later. You're really just trying to get down your base layers right now. And the face is where it gets a little tricky, so I can kind of see that like the lighter color kind of comes down and kind of ends right at about where I put these lines here, and then it kind of turns to white. So I'm just gonna go in pretty light over here. While it's still wet, I'm just gonna take a little, without cleaning my brush, I'm gonna take a little bit of white and just kind of circular motion that, so you can kind of get that blend in there. And honestly, we could take that white and do kind of the same thing with down here, just underneath the chest area, just while it's still a little wet. So it creates a highlight. We don't have to mix a whole nother color for it. And if you put in just white, like while it's dry, it's gonna stand out like pretty heavily. So it kind of helps a bit to do it all at once before things start to solidify. So you can kind of see how the light in this gets a little yellow right over here. So I'm gonna take this light shade that I've been putting everywhere, and I'm just gonna add a little more yellow ochre to it and a little white. We'll go ahead and put a little more of that in there. We'll blend that out. Honestly, I think this might actually call for a little bit of a brighter yellow. So I'm gonna go get that real quick. Okay, so I just added some of this in there, just to kind of give it more of that vibrant sun glow. And then in this area, it gets super light, so I'm gonna also go in with just my plain white again on the edges that I feel like kind of could use it. All right, now that I've kind of got my base down here, I'm gonna go back and revisit this area here in the back because it's definitely not as put together as the front is yet. So I'm gonna find, let's go with this tone here that we haven't used yet out of my 4 originals. And it seems to match pretty close. The one thing I do like about keeping my stuff printed out for a reference photo is I could literally go next to it and just kind of color blot and see, you know, where that is in relation to. See, like that color and that color match pretty well. But you know what? I don't want my cat this like dull. So I'm going to go ahead and use this anyways in the back. And these are just creative choices that I'm choosing to make, and you can do whatever you want with yours. Add a little bit more of that blue in here because it'll help blend better with the background. Maybe a little more black too. A little blue and black. Now, while that all sets up, I'm gonna go ahead and just add in the shading around the eyes, because once that starts to be in there, it really starts to set up. So, and actually look like what you're going for. So I'm just gonna go in and do the pupils first. Remember, you can always go over this as many times as you want. So if this doesn't come out right the first time, it's fine. And we're gonna go over this so it doesn't have to be perfect the first time, but kind of like what I'm doing with these, where I'm layering them so thinly that they stand out later. That is kind of what we're going for. So under here is looking a little barren, so I'm gonna go in and add little light shade here that seems to, and it drags all the way up, so we'll start up here. So you want to think of the highlights as like the top of like the rolls on a lot of things. So like, you know, most cats have an extra layer of just like skin under here that's usually pretty chunky. And that's going to be where all that chub is. So you want that to be the highlight. So same thing with where this cheek kind of ends up. Now, once you start getting further into your layers, like the closer you feel like you are to being done, the more you want to watch like how your brush stroke displays. So like I'm starting to kind of go with the grain because just kind of scribbling is starting to become more noticeable. So really going with the area or the direction of the fur. So getting a little more important. The tiniest bit of shadow back here, so that way you can tell that there's a head behind these ears. And if you're ever just not sure what color is going in there and you're kind of in a rush, just add the mid-tone and then go back and add a highlight or a shadow. So like kind of down here, I wasn't ready to like put down that shadow there yet, but I just threw the mid-tone in there and now it'll be a really easy area to add depth to underneath that chin. Okay, so I just added a little pink to my palette. And I'm just gonna kind of mix that in with one of these like beige tones that I have for the nose here. So always make sure you're sticking with your base tone. And that black underneath there that we had done earlier has already dried. So now, as long as I'm doing these little circular motions and thinning it out, you'll still be able to see it. And that's a nice way to get that depth without having all those harsh lines. Now the next thing are these lines here where we've got our whisker lines. So I'm gonna add a little more white in this area. On a damp brush, we're just going to kind of get our brights in here first, now that we have everything else kind of outlined. I'm just kind of squaring this face off a little more. And I'm gonna add a little Payne's gray and some black again to one of my orange tones to get that shadow, to be able to highlight that a little bit more. And for the shadow of this side here, just because you can see over here, the sunlight is coming from this side. So you always want to pay attention to your light source, because there's always going to be a little bit more of a shadow despite whether or not you see it directly across. So if I know that the side profile over here is going to be in the shade, you want to make sure you can kind of see that. Otherwise, you're just going to kind of have like this like floating animal. So I added a little bit of that Payne's gray with some white, which is just barely off-white over here, but it is going to be just enough to kind of indicate that light source a little bit more. And we'll go over the highlight over here with that same color, and maybe even a little bit more down here, because we're gonna have also shadow down here. And I dragged that up a little bit, so I'm just gonna take a little bit more of our orange tone. So I'm also gonna take a little bit more of that white and kind of go over the eye here, because you can see this is much lighter than everything else. I'm gonna kind of take this and just dab, and that's pretty damn close. So I'm just gonna go for it. And you can see that that kind of drags up and over, so that's where we're gonna head. And as you can either blend things out while it's still wet, or if you've gotten to the point where things are not blending anymore because they are dry, you can just, once your brush starts to run out of paint, just kind of slightly trickle away from it with like tiny little strokes. So it's not like covering everything, but it still leaves that color and it slowly fades out. All right, now I kind of want to go for my eyes. I did add a tiny bit of sap green onto my palette, and I'm just gonna add that to one of my beige tones. So notice how I'm just kind of using all of my base tones to make every other color. So if you do this in one sitting, it becomes a lot easier. This might be a hard method to kind of just keep building off of the same color palette if you are breaking this up, but at least if you kind of keep your colors out on the table, you know roughly what colors you used to make that, and it should be pretty easy for you to get back to it. You know what? That's gonna be too big of a brush, so we're gonna switch to a small one. So I know that that color is not just green, like no eyes are just one color. So I'm gonna kind of add a little bit of that yellow that I grabbed earlier for the sunlight, and I'm just going to kind of mix that halfway into my green color, and maybe let's do a little white too, because that's looking more like a puke green. There we go. Just enough to add a little dimension here and depth to the eyeballs. I'll add that lighter color, but I'm gonna add a little bit more on this side because remember, light source, and the light is really gonna be what creates any sort of depth. So while those are drying, we're gonna kind of move on and just kind of start finishing up all of our other details, making them look just a little bit more realistic. So I'm gonna grab a smaller yet crappy brush because I'm gonna be kind of using this for a lot of my fine brush strokes for the fur. And crappy brushes are, you know, ones that the bristles are just kind of all over the place. They tend to be a lot better as far as getting pieces of fur because it's not as controlled as everything else. So I'm gonna take the lightest white and I'm gonna kind of do the highlight here that kind of creates that air shape. And I'm not caring if I am drawing over it now because the fur is what gives it a lot more texture and life. I can see there's maybe a little pink in here, so I'm gonna take that shade that I took from the nose. I'm just gonna add some of this. And ultimately, finishing this really comes down to how many colors and things can you see that you want to add. You know, I could call it right about now if I wanted to, but for me, I'm looking at this like I see a bunch more tones that I don't have in here. But I know that some people tend to see more colors than others, and it really just depends on if you want to go with more of a realistic, or, you know, you could do the same type of painting monochromatic with, you know, just one color. So how you finish it is entirely up to you. Fan brushes can also be really good for this. As far as making like the patterns, especially with cats because there's stripes, or at least a lot of stripes. If you really don't get it too wet because then it's gonna look bad, but if you kind of brush off some of it, makes it pretty easy to get those lines in there without having them just look like straight lines. Yeah, and the bristles of a fan brush are really good at emulating any sort of fur, or like if you're ever doing like leaves. That's another one that I really love doing it for. And I like to do the fan brush at the very end, just because it's more visible as far as like brush strokes go, because it's so different from everything else we've done. Now that most of this is done, the very last thing that I'm gonna do is retouch up these eyes here. Now that that should be pretty much dry. I'm gonna add a little more of this white shade right above it where that black kind of smudged. And we'll clean up those pencil marks here, so that way we can't see your pencil. All right, we still have these whisker lines. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my pretty frizzed out brush here, and I'm gonna take my mid-tone, or at least one of them, and you can kind of pick and choose however dark the whiskers are, and I'm just gonna kind of dab along the lines. Just enough that you can't really see them. And if those are feeling a little harsh, go back in with your white. Just kind of dab over a little bit, but I watered down my white so that way you can still see them, but not too harshly. Perfect. Now you kind of want to create, every animal is going to have a shadow underneath the eye. So I'm just going to take like a light gray here. And I'm gonna take that gray, add a little bit more black so it gets a little darker. And I'm gonna use that to make the corner. And you never wanna use jet black for anything except for the eyes, because that is going to be the one thing that stands out the most, and the eyes of a portrait are usually the most important part. So I don't mind doing it for that, but as far as like when I had done the black underneath here, I knew I was gonna be covering that up with kind of like a wash over. So that way it doesn't immediately draw attention. Like it's enough that you can see it, but it's not like the main focus. So you never wanna do like corners and stuff like that with like jet black because the pupil should probably be the darkest thing in the entire portrait. Okay, so we are just about finished here. The last details I'm going to add, and probably my favorite ones, are going to be the whiskers and the reflection in the eyes. So you can see that we kind of have our lines here from where we had done the whiskers. And you can see that our whiskers just completely come all the way off the page. And I kind of like to do a rough count, so I can see like 7, 8, maybe like 12 of these, but I'm just gonna kind of do a couple. What I really like to do is water down my white a bit, so that way the fluidity of your white is going to be a lot easier to get consistent. So. I'm gonna get a little closer here. And we've got a couple of like eyebrow whiskers up here, so I kind of want to see in my pattern where that is, so that's right in the light here. So we'll just do a couple of those. And same thing on the other side, so. And you always kind of want to see things in regards to where they end. So I'm looking at like from here, I'm seeing like right at that dip, almost like that second line in, all the way through like halfway through the body. So I'm gonna kind of use that as my guide here. There we go. All right, so we have our whiskers. And then the very last one is, I don't ever really like to follow my photo for this one, but it's just adding a little bit of a reflection in the eyeball. So this is kind of like on, you can see like the white in both eyes are on like different sides. I kind of like to just put them a little bit more symmetrical. So I'll probably follow this a little bit. So I'm gonna add a dot right, upper left, and I like to kind of parallel it. Or not parallel it, I like to kind of mirror that on the other side. And just kind of adds a bit of softness in the eyes when you do that. And then maybe like the tiniest little bit next to it. There. And we have a queso. All right, everyone, so there you have it. That is how I do my pet portraits. So if you guys end up using this video to create your own portrait, I would love to see what you end up making. So if you end up posting it to social media or just want to like send me a DM of, you know, the project that comes out of this, I would really love to see your guys' work. But if you like this video or found it helpful, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and thank you all so much for watching. I will see you next week.